All right, so we are in our last week of our Breaking Spiritual Chains series. So we've talked about how spiritual chains are very heavy emotions, right? Powerful feelings in our life that can just pull our attention, pull our focus from them, and just drag us away from our faith. Sometimes these chains can also be a very silent burden. They can wrap around our life and we just get used to that weight hanging on us for so long that we don't even notice it anymore. We carry them around and we don't notice how much they just drag us down. Through the previous weeks, we talked about spiritual chains of fear, doubt, rejection, and jealousy. In week 1, we looked at how fear can just keep us focused on fear instead of looking out to God. How our fears and anxieties can completely be overwhelming, but no matter how much they surround us, we serve a God that is much bigger and more powerful than our fears. In week 2, we looked at how doubt can have us looking at ourselves and leaning on our own understanding. We talked about how our thoughts can get tossed and blown around like waves in the wind, especially when we get hit with tough questions and challenges in our faith. But we need to be able to embrace those hard questions and those challenges, but we also need to be able to face them anchored on a rock that is Jesus Christ. So when we are in doubt, we can lean and rely on our faith to carry us through, and it makes us that much stronger for it on the other side. Week 3, we talked about rejection and how we don't serve a Lord that is tucked away securely in a heavenly palace, but we serve a Lord who is alive, active, and empathetic, who came down from heaven's throne and walked a mile in our shoes. We serve a Lord who understands what we go through. We serve a Lord who is rejected by this world, but loved it so much anyways that he laid down his life for each and every one of us. And we're not rejected or forsaken. We are loved, we are cherished, we are valued, and we are bought by the blood of Jesus Christ. Last week, we tackled the spiritual chain of jealousy and how we can place our happiness and value in the wrong things. How we can set up idols in our lives and constantly strive and chase after them. And how this spiritual chain of jealousy continually leaves us wanting and chasing and empty, because the only thing that can fill that God-sized hole in our life is God, and everything else will fall completely short. And to break that spiritual chain of jealousy, we need to seek the joy in our life rather than pursue happiness. And the only way to seek that joy, pursue that joy, is to pursue God. So I picked this series and these chains each week because they're struggles that we all deal with at some point in our life. All of us will have these chains wrapped around our hearts at one time or another. But we're not meant to stay in the bondage of these chains, right? My prayer for this series every single week has been for us to recognize these chains, for us to be able to speak the truth about these chains, and how we can learn to be set free from these chains with the power and the blood of Jesus Christ. And I think so far, we covered a lot of ground, right? But this week, we're going to wrap this series up by focusing on what I think is the most challenging chain to talk about. And I feel it's very difficult because there tends to be a certain stigma that goes hand in hand with this chain. And to me, the stigma helps to wrap this chain even tighter around us, because it's not something that people like to talk about or even usually feel comfortable talking about. And that is the spiritual chain of depression. Depression is defined as a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness or a loss of interest. Depression affects how we feel, it affects how we think, and it can lead to physical or emotional problems. Depression often goes hand in hand with great despair, with great grief, and with great loss. And it's a feeling every single one of us will battle in our life. But if it's so common, why is it an uncomfortable subject? If everyone will go through it, why is it so taboo? And if everybody suffers about it, then why don't we talk about it? Well, because like I said, there's a certain stigma that's attached to it. There's a certain way we think how everything's supposed to be, how we're supposed to act. Depression, I feel, is almost like a taboo subject in the church. We're not supposed to feel that way, especially as Christians. We're supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be joyous people. We're always supposed to be full of love and full of the Holy Spirit. On Sunday morning in the sanctuary, you can see the smiles of all the people's faces, but I assure you, behind those pearly whites, there are many people that are hurting. There are many people that are sad. There are many people that are struggling. And there's many people that are battling this chain of depression that's wrapping around their heart. Yet you won't be able to tell it by the face they're wearing for you. The phenomenon of putting on a happy face is not just reserved for Sunday morning church service, but it's also there Monday morning at your office, when you try to put your best foot forward for your coworkers. It's there on Tuesday evening when you're around the dinner table with your family, sharing that meal, trying to keep that appearance of perfection and normalcy. It's there on Friday night when you're out with your friends, putting that fake smile on and pretending like there's nothing going on behind it. It's not something unique to Christians. Many people out there feel like they can't show that. They feel guilt or shame, so they try to hide it. Depression is like the 7-ton elephant in a room. Everybody chooses to ignore it, but I'll tell you who doesn't ignore it: God. How do I know God doesn't ignore the subject? Because it's in His Word. You'll find God speak about in the Bible about depression in phrases such as downcast, brokenhearted, troubled, miserable, despairing, warning. Do a word study and you'll be surprised how many times these appear in the Bible. You'll see depression in several stories in the Bible where people really battled through some dark and hopeless situations in their life. So I'm attacking this chain of depression this week because I feel it's important to talk about that giant elephant in the room. Mainly because God's not afraid to talk about it to us. And I believe God knows what kind of devastation depression can do in a life, to our body, to our mind, to our emotions, and to our spirit, and this chain's wrapped around our hearts. So I want to start off talking tonight talking about a man who is said to be after God's own heart. A man that ferociously loved God, a man whose faith was an inspiration, a man whose trust in God literally made giants fall, and a man who had such blessing and privilege in his life that he became king and ushered in a golden era for God's chosen people in the kingdom of Israel. And yeah, you probably figured out who I'm talking about. I'm talking about David.
I was going to say
Kevin too.
The king stuff got a little weird.
It's David for sure. But it's easy to tell that David was a man after God's heart when you read many of the Psalms that he wrote. Most of them sing about triumph and joy and praise for the Lord our God, like Psalm 18:2. Someone?
The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold.
Or if you're not familiar with that one, maybe you're familiar with Psalm 23, especially towards the end, 4-6.
Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. You are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Psalms are comforting, right? They're victorious, make us feel good. But these weren't all the Psalms that David wrote. David just didn't have nothing but victories and sunshine in his life, right? We can forget that David was a man that fought with anguish and loneliness, a man whose heart broke and cried out over sin that he committed in his life, and also a man that was overwhelmed by the guilt of those sins that came with that sin. We forget that David fought with grief and loss in his life. David had 3 sons that he lost during his lifetime. We know David wrote these comforting psalms that we might be hanging up in our cute little motivational plaques in our offices, right? But we forget that David wrote some very soul-crushing things as well, such as Psalm 69, 1-3.
Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the miry depths, where there is no foothold. I have come into the deep waters. The floods engulf me. I am worn out calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God.
It's a little bit different of an outlook, isn't it? You don't think you'll see that one on a greeting card. But in all seriousness, have you ever felt that way? That the water level in your life is right here, right up to your neck?
Anytime literally anything doesn't go the way I want.
Right. You know, maybe those floods, man, they just rushed at you all at once because something crazy happened, right? It's sudden, it's unexpected. Or maybe in your life that water level is just slowly rising because it's one thing after another, after another, after another until you're barely keeping your head up above the water. David says there's no foothold to stand on. So that means the only thing keeping him afloat in this situation is his own power. But he also says that he's sinking. Because if you're just relying on yourself, your arms and your legs to try to hold yourself up, you're going to get tired of treading that water. David expresses that there doesn't seem to be an end in sight in this. He says these deep waters and this flood is engulfing. That water's just pouring. There's no end in sight. It's a very hopeless situation. David describes in verse 3 that he is worn out by calling for help. He's yelling so much that his throat is parched. Have you ever been to a sporting event or at a concert where you yell so much that your voice is just raspy or shot? You put so much strain on your vocal cords and you can't talk. But imagine that you're crying out with that much force and velocity, that much intensity. Imagine you've been shouting for help for so long that your voice is gone and you just can't yell out anymore. On top of this, David says at the end of verse 3 that he's not only yelling, but he's looking out for God. David knows God's with him in that situation, but he can't see him. He's trying to find God, and he's looking around and desperately searching so much that his eyes are now tired. His eyes are failing. Let me ask you, have you ever been in a season like that? You're going through something, you know God's there, but you can't see him, you can't hear him, you can't feel him in those moments. You're crying for help, you're crying for deliverance, but there's just nothing coming. You're yelling out, you're struggling, you've been at it for so long that you're just now at the point where you're just worn out. You're done. It feels like David's at that point. He continues in the psalm to talk about how his enemies are surrounding him. He's feeling overwhelmed. He talks about his foolishness and guilt being laid out before God. David talks about his feelings of disgrace, scorn, and shame. And when we're in that situation, when we're drowning, we get very overwhelmed, right? It feels like everything is happening and we can't deal with anything going wrong because it's everything that's going wrong. Our only defense, we just curl up, we just shut down with it. Now, I'm not sure when David wrote this song in his life. Usually depression wraps around traumatic events and very stressful events in your life. It can be from major financial problems. It can start when there's difficulty in your relationship. It can come from a long history of abuse, or it can come from grief or loss, especially one that you didn't expect. If I had to take a guess, I would say when David felt this depressed, I would say it was the grief and loss category, because David dealt with that many, many times in his life. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we have the story where David commits one of his most famous sins. I'm talking about the story of David and Bathsheba. This is where we start to see a transition in David's life. Before this, he was a warrior king that would go out in front of the battle and fight with his men. But in this fight, however, he's just a king. He's sending his men to the front lines while he stays back in his palace. One of those boring nights, he walks out on a palace balcony and he witnesses Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop. Now, David is a king. He has basically everything he wants at his fingertips, but now he wants something that he shouldn't have. Bathsheba to David should have been off limits because it was his friend Uriah's wife. A friend who fought with him side by side. A friend who happens to be still one of the men that were fighting in the front line. Sin can have us very short-sighted, just focusing on a gratification and not the consequences. That night, David didn't think about the consequences. He called Bathsheba to the palace and she became pregnant from that encounter. David starts to worry now about the consequences after the fact. He tries to cover his sin by pulling Uriah back from the battle and sending him home to be with his wife. And David's hope is Uriah's going to sleep with her, and then he'll think the child's his, and everything's going to be okay. There's a problem with this plan. Uriah won't go home. He can't sleep under the roof when the rest of the men are sleeping on the ground in the battlefield. David even tries to get Uriah drunk, thinking that this is going to change his integrity and his judgment. But even after all that, Uriah still sleeps outside and just wants to get back to the battle. David then gets desperate. He comes up with plan B. If Uriah is dead, then David would be free to marry Bathsheba. And if he does it quickly, he could cover up the fact that the pregnancy actually happened before they got married. So David does the unthinkable. He sends Uriah to the front line where the battle's the fiercest and orders the general to withdraw, making sure Uriah gets stuck out there and assures he gets struck down in combat. David buried his sin with more sin, and for a short time, David's scheme worked. He made Bathsheba his wife, and she bare him a son, and no one was the wiser. Well, I'm sure David felt like he got away with something, but that's the thing about sin. You can't hide it from God, right? In 2 Samuel chapter 12, God uses the prophet Nathan to call David out and expose his sin. God gave Nathan that wisdom, and then God gave Nathan a prophecy for David, how his sin was going to affect his life, how his sin was going to affect his family's life. And Nathan gave the prophecy how it's going to affect the child, because that child born in sin is going to die. 2 Samuel 12, 15 through 18.
After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when he spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate.
David's behavior is very erratic, right? His attendants were afraid to tell him the child died because they had no idea what David was going to do with that news. It would be one of those scenarios where they're pushing each other. You go tell him. No, you go tell him. No, you go tell him. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot. I can make light on it, but honestly, I don't blame them, because an erratic king can put your head on a spike just because you delivered him bad news. David didn't do this though. In fact, David's behavior was probably more bizarre than they could even imagine. In 2 Samuel 12, 20 through 23.
But David got up from the ground, after he had washed, put on lotions and changed his clothes. He went to the house of the Lord to worship. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food and he ate. His attendants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now the child is dead. You get up and eat." He answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me."
David just picked himself up, dusted himself up, and just went right back like nothing ever happened, right? I'm sure out of all the reactions that the attendants thought would happen, that probably wasn't even on the list. The reality is, many of us react to trauma that way. Many of us face sadness that way. Many of us face depression that way. Many of us just look at it and just go, la 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 la. We plug our eyes, we plug our ears, pretend it doesn't exist. I'm not sure if it's just because we're in shock, or we don't know how to react, or maybe it's just fear that if we acknowledge it, that somehow it's suddenly going to become real. And we play this game too, that when people ask, "Hey, how's it going?" we just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, "Man, stuff happens. It is what it is," or, "What can you do?" Or the classic, "I'm fine. Really, I'm fine." We put on that smile and we go outside for the whole world to see, and we go about with our head held high. But inside what's going on is a different story. Inside, we're like that in Psalm 69. Inside, that water's up to our neck, and it keeps getting deeper. Inside, we feel like we're sinking because our strength is giving out. Inside, we're crying out because until our throat is raw, and our eyes are tired from looking for the way out. Inside, we feel lost, alone, powerless, and defeated. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, whether we want the world to see it or not, that chain of depression is wrapped right around our heart, and it has us firmly in its grip. There's no shame in that. We feel ashamed. We may feel disgraced or guilty. We can feel angry or overwhelmed, but I want to let you know that these are natural feelings that we cycle through in traumatic events. These traumatic events change our circumstances and our environment very, very quickly. Our body, our thoughts, our emotions, they can't shift as quickly as the event. We need to be able to take time to be able to process it through. We need to be able to adapt to the new reality that's going on. And these cycles that we go through, that is our natural way to help us process that. And if we don't process these changes, that's when it gets very dangerous. These chains of depression come in and they take that natural cycle that we're going through. They grab it and they grind it to a halt. And we get stuck in that very bad place in that cycle. And we can't move on to the next healing step. I feel at the beginning of that Psalm 69, David was stuck in that very bad part of that cycle to the point where he felt like he was drowning in it. And we've all been there, and we've all felt that. But David recognizes this, and he takes it as an opportunity to pray to God to get him through that. We see that in Psalm 69, 13 through 15.
But I pray to you, Lord, in the time of your favor and your great love, O Lord, or O God. Answer me with your sure salvation. Rescue me from the mire. Do not let me sink. Deliver me from those who hate me, from the deep waters. Do not let the flood waters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me.
Just praying to God. Don't let me drown in this. It's God, I know your salvation. I know your love. I'm praying to you that you can pull me out of this mud. I'm praying that you can deliver me from these deep waters. I pray not to let these flood waters and these depths swallow me. God, don't let me get buried in this pit. Don't let me get trapped in this low point, Lord. It's a very powerful prayer because these chains of depression want us to keep us in that low point. It wants to keep us in that state of drowning, stuck and buried in that pit. It's the tool the enemy uses to lie to us and to say, man, this is the end of the road. This is the end of the cycle. There's nothing but pain. There's nothing but sorrow. There's nothing but despair. But that's a lie. That's a lie straight from the enemy. And David recognizes this lie. We see that in Psalm 69, 29.
But as for me, afflicted and in pain, may your salvation, God, protect me.
David acknowledges, yeah, I'm hurting. Right now, I'm afflicted. Right now, I'm suffering. Right now, I'm in pain. But in his next breath, he says, God, may your salvation protect me. Your salvation, your deliverance from this hurting, your deliverance from this affliction, your deliverance from this suffering, your deliverance from this pain. Let it protect me. Let me stay focused that this low point isn't the end of the cycle. But protect me as I move on and I process through these feelings. Protect me as I move on to this next step. Protect me, Lord, as I heal from this. That's exactly how we break these chains of depression. We push through. When depression tries to grind us to the halt, we push through. We don't fall into the trap that the pain and suffering are the end, but we focus on the salvation and the deliverance from that. We focus on God, who is the one that can protect us and to bring us through that. Now, David went through a lot, and God helped him a lot. You can see that when you read many of the Psalms, but he's not the only person in the Bible that dealt with the chain of depression. The prophet Elijah also struggled with it at a very low point in his life, which ironically came right after one of his greatest victories. Now, what you got to know about Elijah is that he was raised up by God during a turbulent time in Israel's history. For 22 years, a king named Ahab ruled over Israel, and like his father before him, Ahab thought sin was a very trivial matter. Ahab married a pagan princess named Jezebel, and he also became a worshiper of her gods, the Canaanite god of Baal. There was a point in Ahab's reign that for nearly 3 years, God put a drought over the land. While this drought was happening, there was a couple other things that were going on. First, God was working on Elijah. He was raising him up. He was performing miracles. He was spreading the name of the Lord to the people. Second, Jezebel was killing men of God. Many of them were going into hiding to survive, and Elijah was one of them on that execution list. Last but not least, good land was very, very sparse. So the king and his servant were searching the countryside for pasture for the king's horses and mules. And on the day they were out searching around, the Lord told Elijah, it's time. It's time to present yourself to Ahab, and it's time for this drought to end. This meeting between Elijah and Ahab wasn't going to be just a normal meeting. Elijah sent word to the king for him to meet him at Mount Carmel and tell all the people to meet us there. He told the king to bring 450 prophets of Baal with him and 400 of Jezebel's priests who eat at her table. Because on Mount Carmel, it was going to be a sacrifice showdown. And we see this in 1 Kings 18, 22 through 24.
Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left. But Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good.
Sacrifice showdown. Rules are simple. Prep the altar, sacrifice however you like. Call on your God, sing, dance, cry out, whatever you want to do. Just don't start the fire. The fire has to be brought by God. The Bible tells us that the prophets of Baal called the name of Baal from morning until noon. They danced around the altar crying and trying to invoke their God. Elijah sat back and he taunted him. He says, hey, maybe you just need to shout louder. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's in deep thought. Maybe he's traveling, or maybe he's just sleeping. Just need to yell louder to wake him up.
That's actually what he basically said.
The prophets of Baal were not entertained. They kicked the frenzy up a notch, right? They started slashing themselves with their swords and spears and trying to call out to their God with their blood. They frantically were prophesying all through the afternoon, all through the evening, but to no avail. Their set altar remained just as unlit as it was this morning. Then it was Elijah's turn. And we pick this up in 1 Kings 18, 30 through 39.
This one's 4 slides, 5 slides.
Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he prepared the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seeds of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said. And they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God.
Elijah won. And if this display at the altars was not enough of a miracle to prove who God was, Elijah turned to Ahab and said, the sound of heavy rain's coming. In other words, the drought of 3 years was over. In the distance, a small cloud formed on the horizon. The clouds grew, the winds grew, the heavy rain fell on the land for the first time in 3 years. Ahab jumped on his horse and he rode back to the palace. The Bible tells us Elijah in that moment was so full of God's power, so full of the Holy Spirit, that he took off on foot after Ahab and beat him to that palace. Put yourself in Elijah's shoes. You're probably feeling really good in this moment, right? He's been waiting for God to use him, and after 3 long years, God showed up, and he showed up in a mighty way, probably in a much better way than anything Elijah could have imagined. Elijah probably thought, man, this was the turning point. The whole nation just saw what happened. The king just saw what happened. Elijah's probably thinking of Ahab and Jezebel. They're in that palace right now. They're repenting. They're giving their hearts over to God. Ahab and Jezebel, they're going to get ready to lead this nation and all the people right back to God. Elijah's probably thinking, man, those 3 years of hiding and those 3 years of running, man, they were rough, but they're so well worth it because it's over now. It's over. Elijah gets a message from Queen Jezebel, but it's not the one he was expecting. The message says something along the lines of, "You're dead, man, Elijah." In fact, she vows on everything she believes in that he would be dead in the next 24 hours. And you can almost hear those women getting knocked right out of Elijah's cells. He wasn't joyous or victorious anymore. Elijah was terrified, and he ran for his life. He was right back in that state he started before all this great stuff happened. Now, have you ever been going through something for a very long time and finally one day, man, here's the breakthrough. A moment where, man, this is it. I can turn the page. I can close that chapter. Maybe that day was so profound where you're like, man, I could just shut this book, toss it away, and start writing my new story. We all went through that. We all went through these droughts in our life, and we all had that day where it finally rains and it feels like, man, things can grow again. We've all been in Elijah's shoes, though, where we're in a position where something unexpected happens, and we're right back in that dreadful season once again. It's like one step forward and 5 steps back. Elijah was defeated. Elijah was hopeless. Elijah didn't want to live anymore. We see that in 1 Kings 19, 3-4.
Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors."
Chain of depression hit Elijah, especially when he didn't expect it. The day before, man, he was on cloud 9. He thought everything was done, over with. He'd done his part in life, but now, here it is again. It made him feel weak, made him feel tired, made him feel like he wasn't himself. He wasn't the prophet that prayed to God to do these incredible miracles anymore. He was a man laying on the ground, praying to die. The reality is, though, it's the same man. The reality is, it's the same Elijah, with the chains of depression, try to rob us of our good qualities. They try to drag us down, they try to make us ineffective. Well, let me tell you, God sees you. God knows you. He sees us in our good days, and he sees us on our bad days. And when we have those bad days, we can turn to him, and he can restore us. I want you to see what happens to Elijah next in 1 Kings 19, 5-9.
And he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night.
God knew what laid ahead for Elijah. He knew Elijah needed to rest and recover before he could take that journey. But resting and eating were things that Elijah wasn't doing for himself. Many times we get that like that when we get depressed. We get in that funk, and we just don't want to take care of ourselves the way we should. If we want to break that chain of depression, we can't neglect to take care of ourselves and take care of our basic needs. We need to eat, we need to rest. Those are very important. But we also need to be able to do that, to be able to be strengthened so we can get up and go to the next part of our journey as well. The Bible tells us that Elijah made it to the cave on Mount Horeb. When Elijah was in that cave, he heard a word from God that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replies, "Man, I've been following you, God. The Israelites, they rejected you. They tore down your altar. They put your followers to death by the sword. God, I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." God replied in 1 Kings 19, 11-13.
The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. and after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?"
Now I want you to know something in this. God comes to Elijah, and there are many things that Elijah witnesses here. A strong and powerful wind that tore the mountain apart and shattered rocks, but that wasn't what God was using to speak to him. An earthquake that I'm sure shook the mountain, but that wasn't what God was using to speak to him. A great fire, and we've seen in the past God speak through fires, but it wasn't this time. After all those strong forces, God came to Elijah in a gentle whisper. When we're in the middle of our depression, we wonder, why am I going through this? Why is this happening to me? Sometimes the only way we can hear that whisper is when everything else is silent. Sometimes the only way God is going to get us to look up is when we're not completely flat on our back. Sometimes the only way to get our fullest attention is when there is no other distractions in our life. And sometimes that is the only way that we're going to listen to Him. That could be a very hard way to have a conversation with God, but sometimes that is the only way we will have that conversation with God. And at the end of the verse, God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here again?" And Elijah repeats the previous answer. "God, I'm following you. I've been trying to convince Israel. They rejected you. They tear down your altars. They kill everyone who follows you. And I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Elijah's just 100% fixed on his current situation. And God kindly tells Elijah, "No, that's not what you're doing here." God says you're going to go out to Damascus, and you're going to anoint Hazael and Jehu, who are going to be the next kings over Judah and Israel, and they're going to take down these rebellious and evil kings. That's not all, though. You're going to find and anoint a young man named Elijah, who's going to succeed you as prophet. God's telling Elijah, you didn't fail. You didn't fail at your purpose. It's just going to happen different than what you think. God's telling Elijah, man, you're not alone. In this fight, you thought you were alone, but there's 3 that God started preparing well before you, preparing for the next chapter. And God even tells Elijah in the next breath that there was 7,000 more followers in Israel that had not bent the knee to bow. It wasn't all on Elijah's shoulders. God shows Elijah that he's not done with him, and there's far greater plan and purpose for him that he just didn't see yet. I'm going to wrap up tonight with a couple last thoughts here. First, these chains of depression, they cloud our perspective. They make us only see the short term. They make us feel like we're stuck. But when these chains fall off, we can discover what's important in our life once again. Depression often follows on our coattails of traumatic events. And these traumatic changes that happen can be very, very difficult. And I'm not going to downplay those in any way, shape, or form. But when we get on the other side of them, we can start to step into a new life and a new beautiful things that God has for us that can happen. We can have some brand new blessings in our life that were unexpected. We can have new purposes and new understanding that we would not have been able to have any other way. God can set our minds free from the wrong ideas that hold us like strongholds in our life and help us break through to see how beautiful our life really is. Recall the question that God was asking Elijah on the mountain. What are you doing here? Elijah could only focus on that present situation, those shortcomings. Elijah thought he failed, but the reality was there was no changing Ahab and Jezebel's hearts. God already had a different path that involved Elijah raising up ones that can make a difference. God blessed Elijah unexpectedly, making him a mentor of Elijah. And later down the road, when the cloak gets passed to Elijah, he's able to do great and glorious things in the name of God. But you know what? If Elijah just stayed in that chain of depression when his life fell apart, he wouldn't have had any of that. He would have missed that entire chapter of his life. That season when things are going completely wrong is just that. It's a season. And that, my friend, just understand seasons in our life change. Even when David was going through his most difficult times and wrote in agony and pain in Psalms, he knew that that feeling was just going to be temporary. That muck, that mire, that pain, that affliction would eventually give way to God's righteous salvation if he kept seeking Him. And that's what we need to do when the chain of depression and sadness and grief wraps around our hearts. Seek God. We need to remember that God can come and meet us in those moments when everything's quiet. God can meet us in those moments when we need to stop, and He's right there with provision when we need to be able to snap out of it, because God's not afraid to meet us right where we're at. He's able to be there for us. He never leaves us, and sometimes we just need to be able to stop and listen to that quiet whisper and remember who God is. In Psalms 46 through 10, God says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among nations. I will be exalted in the earth." Sometimes we just got to do that. We got to be able to be still and know. Or maybe better yet, be still and get to know Him. The last thing I want to tell you about the chain of depression, not alone. You're not the only one that's ever going to go through this. In fact, you're not meant to go through it alone. God put the church together. He put a fellowship together. So when somebody's down, others can lift them up. Don't ever feel like you're alone. Don't ever feel ashamed asking for help, because that's what the church is here for. And likewise, if you see somebody going through that rough time, be the church and be the encouragement for them. I gotta tell you, when I lost my father not too long ago, about a year and a half or so, I still remember the kindness of the people that reached out, the neighbors that cooked meals for us, the people from the church and work that called, and just overwhelming overall support at that time. And it meant far more than people could imagine. It left such an impact. The last thing I want to say is, no matter what you're going through, there is a God who sees you. There is a God who loves you, and a Savior that saw you on your best day, saw you on your worst day, and He died for you anyway to redeem you. And when you're praying like Elijah that you can't go on anymore, just remember that God is your refuge, and He is your strength. He's your provider, and He will renew you. And when you're like David, sinking in that mud, and that flood waters up to your chin, remember, God is your rock, and He is your foundation. He is your ever-present help in times of trouble. Turn to Him and hold on to those truths. Hold on to those truths, defeat the lies. And You'll let that chain of depression fall from your heart and be free to turn that next chapter of your life that God has for you. So I pray as we close the series, I pray that it's helped. I pray that it gave some perspective on the spiritual chains in our life that we struggle with. And I pray it's helped some of us break free of those. And I pray that as we face our next challenges in life and come across fear or doubt or rejection or jealousy or depression, we can hold fast to some of these lessons or stories that we went through. And I hope that we feel when we feel these chains of wrap around our hearts or our minds, we can recognize them, take them captive, and know how to free ourselves from them. Next week, we're going to actually start something completely different. We're going to do a new Bible study. At AMP, we talked about the Apostle Paul. We've talked about some of the prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and we covered that Jesus guy a time or two in here too. But I want to start a series on someone that we haven't really studied or we haven't really talked much in about a year and a half, and that is the Apostle John. He was one of Jesus' disciples. He was one of his closest friends. He was a critical part of the early church, and he wrote 5 books in the New Testament, including the Gospel, 3 epistles, and Revelation. So we're going to talk about him a little bit, and we're going to study the books that he wrote. We're going to look at the Gospel, see what makes it different from the other Gospels. We're going to look at the 3 epistles that he wrote, because even though they're short and simple, there's a lot there to unpack. And we might talk a little bit about Revelation, but I'm not going to go really in depth about it, because that's an entire different ball of wax. And I want to focus more on John's life and his perspective rather than prophecy. So that's what we're doing next week. Still want a working title on it, but it's the Apostle John.